You're about to learn why the most dangerous psychological training program of the 17th century was disguised as a prayer book. In 1675, a Spanish priest in Rome published a small volume titled The Spiritual Guide, 240 pages, 20 editions in 6 years. By the time the Roman Inquisition realized what they were actually looking at, more than 200 people in Rome alone had been trained in its method. Several convents had reorganized their internal life around its practice, and somewhere between 12,000 and 20,000 letters between practitioners had been seized from the author's possession. The author's name was Miguel de Molinos. He died in a prison cell. The Pope personally signed the document that erased his teaching from the Catholic record. 263 charges were filed against him. 68 specific propositions from his book were officially condemned and sealed away. Here's what you have to understand from the start. The Catholic Church didn't crush this man because he was a heretic. The Church crushed him because the people who learned his method became impossible to control. You've been told this is religious history. It isn't. It's the missing chapter in the only thing this channel ever talks about. Silence as power, silence as defense, silence as the one weapon that authority can't prosecute, can't intercept, and can't answer back to. What Machiavelli wrote about is politics. What the Stoics wrote about is philosophy. This Spaniard wrote about as a daily practice. He gave it to anyone who could read, and that's exactly why he had to disappear. This is the story of Miguel de Molinos. More importantly, it's the story of what the Vatican actually feared and why every system of authority since has feared the same thing. Start with the man. Miguel de Molinos was born in 1628 in a small Aragonese village called Munisa. He trained as a priest, took his theology degree, and in 1663 he traveled to Rome carrying letters of recommendation. He was supposed to spend a few months there. He stayed for the next 22 years. Rome at that time was the spiritual center of European Christianity. It was also the most surveilled city on earth. Every order had its informants. Every convent had its visitors. Every preacher was watched, ranked, and quietly assessed for doctrinal drift. To survive in Rome, you had to know exactly what you could say, exactly what you could write, and exactly which words would put a target on your back. For more than a decade, Molinos said almost nothing publicly. He took confessions, he directed convents, he acquired a reputation quietly as the most effective spiritual director in the city. By the early 1670s, half of Rome's Catholic intelligentsia was meeting with him in private. In 1675, he published the book. It carried the imprimatur of Raimondo Capizucchi, the Pope's own theologian. It carried approbations from senior figures in 5 different religious orders, including the Jesuits. 5 separate ranks of the Catholic apparatus reviewed the manuscript and found nothing wrong with it. Look at that list again. The Jesuits approved it. The same Jesuits who would, 6 years later, lead the public campaign to destroy it. What changed in those 6 years? Not the book. The book is what you have to understand next. Strip the religious language from the spiritual guide, and you're left with a manual. Not a book of prayers, not a meditation guide, a specific technical instruction set for how to remove yourself from your own emotions in 3 stages. The first stage was discipline of speech. Stop explaining yourself, stop defending yourself, stop offering opinions when no one has asked. The world will demand your reaction at every turn, and the practice begins with refusing to give it. You've heard this before on this channel. It's the same idea Machiavelli described in The Prince, where he wrote that a ruler who reveals his intentions has already lost. Molinos turned it from a political principle into a personal vow. Anyone could take it, anyone could keep it, no king required. The second stage was discipline of thought. Once your speech was silent, your inner monologue had to go silent too. You stop rehearsing arguments. You stop running imagined scenarios in your head. You stop reacting to your own thoughts as if they were demands. The closest secular comparison you can find is Stoic apatheia, the discipline of refusing to let externals trigger an internal verdict. Marcus Aurelius wrote about it. Epictetus practiced it. Molinos formalized it into a step you could measure your day by. He called it acquired contemplation. The third stage was the dangerous one. Molinos taught that once you'd achieved perfect interior silence, the result was something he named the annihilation of the will. You stopped wanting outcomes. You stopped grading your day. You stopped flinching from suffering, and you stopped reaching for relief. You became, in his exact phrase, indifferent. This is what every modern psychologist calls gray rock. This is what Stoics call apatheia. This is what political strategists call cold detachment. Molinos didn't invent it. He just wrote it down in a way anyone could practice, without permission, without a teacher, and without any institutional supervision. Now ask the question this section is built around: what happens to a society when 10,000 people quietly learn this technique at the same time? Here's the part the official histories rush past. In 1680, a Jesuit priest named Paulo Segneri published a counter-treatise titled The Agreement Between Effort and Quiet in Prayer. Segneri's argument was that Molinos' method was wrong because spiritual progress required effort, struggle, and ascetic discipline. You had to fight your nature, you had to wrestle with sin, you had to perform. The spiritual guide said the opposite. The moment you fight, you lose. The moment you struggle, you've given the struggle the power to define you. The moment you perform virtue, your virtue is theater. The Jesuits filed charges. The case went before the Holy Office of the Roman Inquisition. In 1681, the Holy Office issued its ruling. They ruled in favor of Molinos. They declared the spiritual guide orthodox, and then, to make the point unmistakable, they placed Segneri's book, the book attacking Molinos, on the index of forbidden books. Read that again. The Inquisition, in a formal proceeding, told the Jesuits they were wrong, and Molinos was right. The most powerful religious surveillance apparatus in 17th century Europe, officially licensed the doctrine of total interior silence and condemned the doctrine of effort. 4 years later, they reversed themselves and arrested him. What happened in those 4 years? Not theology, not doctrine, not a single new sentence in any of his books. What happened was that the technique started to work. Letters started traveling, practitioners started multiplying, convents started reorganizing themselves around the practice. By 1685, the Inquisition realized that they had personally certified in writing a method that had quietly produced an underground network of people who had stopped reacting to anything Rome did to them. That's when the political problem appeared. And the political problem is what every section of this script is going to circle back to. Stop here for a second. You think you've been watching a story about a religious cult? You haven't. You've been watching a story about what authority is actually for. Authority, every form of authority, religious, political, corporate, personal, runs on one resource. It runs on your reaction. A boss who threatens you needs you to flinch. A manipulator who insults you needs you to defend yourself. A church that condemns you needs you to apologize. An interrogator who applies pressure needs you to break. A narcissist in your life needs you to explain. The reaction is the currency. Without it, every system of control above you runs out of fuel. Molinos didn't write a religious doctrine. He wrote the most efficient method anyone had ever described for going broke in that economy. He built people who, by the time they finished his 3 stages, no longer had reactions to confiscate. The Jesuits weren't wrong about the threat. They were wrong about its category. They thought it was theology. It was the systematic disarming of every lever the institution had ever used to keep them in line. The reason this matters to you, watching this video 350 years later, is that nothing has changed. The economy of reaction is still how every system around you survives. The technique Molinos described still works. The only difference between 1685 and now is that today, when you practice it, no one calls the Inquisition. They just call you cold. Go back to the story. Watch what happens next with this in mind. By 1685, the spiritual guide had been translated into Italian, French, Spanish, Latin, English, German, and Dutch. It had gone through 20 editions in Italy alone. It was being read by cardinals and dukes and laypeople and contemplative nuns, and it was being practiced as a daily method by enough people to start showing up in confessions. When Roman priests began hearing the same phrases in confession from completely unrelated penitents, they realized something they hadn't understood before. The book wasn't being read. It was being trained on. Investigators discovered communities of nuns who had reorganized their internal prayer life around the practice of quiet. They discovered networks of correspondence between Italian and Spanish practitioners. They discovered that confessors all over Rome were silently coaching lay people through Molinos' 3 stages. The author of the book was by this point the most sought-after spiritual director in the city. He was personally guiding cardinals. He was advising the Pope's own confessor. He was, if you read the Inquisition's later report carefully, in regular contact with figures inside the Vatican itself. In France, the technique was already spreading. A widow named Jeanne-Marie Bouvier de la Motte-Guillon, born in 1648, had read Molinos and built her own version of the method. She acquired a disciple. His name was François de Salignac de la Motte-Fenelon, and he would later become Archbishop of Cambrai. He would also be condemned by Rome in 1699 for defending her. This is what an institution calls a network problem. Watch what an institution does about it. On the night of July 18, 1685, pontifical guards entered Molinos' residence in Rome and arrested him. They walked him to the Castel Sant'Angelo, the fortress on the Tiber that the Vatican used as a political prison. They took his correspondence with them. The number that survives in the records is somewhere between 12,000 and 20,000 letters. 263 propositions were extracted from his books and his correspondence and his interrogation. Initially, he defended them. By May of 1687, he stopped defending them. The Inquisition Tribunal narrowed the list to 68 specific propositions and prepared formal articles of censure for each one. On September 3, 1687, Molinos appeared in public for the last time, performed a ritual abjuration of his own teaching, and was sentenced to perpetual imprisonment. On November 20th of the same year, Pope Innocent XI signed the apostolic constitution Coelestis Pastor, formally condemning the 68 propositions and writing Molinos out of the official record. Miguel de Molinos died in his cell on December 28, 1696, 9 years and 4 months after the abjuration, 21 years after the book that started it all. Now look at the parallel. In 1512, almost 200 years before any of this, a Florentine bureaucrat named Niccolò Machiavelli was arrested by the returning Medici regime. They threw him in the Bargello prison. They tortured him with the strappado, a device that hoists you off the floor by ropes tied to your wrists and then drops you, dislocating your shoulders. They dropped him 6 times. He didn't break. He went home in 1513 to his small estate in the Tuscan countryside, and he wrote The Prince. The prince argued that a ruler must conceal his true intentions, never let his emotions show, and never explain his decisions until the decision is already complete. It argued that the appearance of power requires the discipline of silence. It argued that the leader who reacts is the leader who has already lost. The Prince circulated in manuscript for decades. It was published in 1532, and in 1559, the Catholic Church placed it, along with every other book Machiavelli had ever written, on the index of forbidden books. Same pattern. A man writes a method for becoming unreadable, undefeatable, and unable to be coerced. The institutions of his era recognize that pattern as a direct threat. The institutions then spend the next century trying to bury what he wrote.
Machiavelli was tortured before he wrote his book. Molinos was tortured after he wrote his. They wrote the same book. They wrote a manual for becoming the kind of person whose reactions can't be commandeered. You can take this further. Marcus Aurelius wrote a private notebook, the Meditations, in the 2nd century after Christ. It was a notebook for himself. He wrote about apatheia, the discipline of refusing to assign emotional verdicts to events outside your control. The book sat unread for centuries. When it was rediscovered, it slowly became one of the most quietly influential documents in Western philosophy. The technique still works. The practice still produces what it produced for him. Every human being who has ever wanted to stop being controlled by other human beings has needed exactly what these 3 men wrote down. Machiavelli, Marcus Aurelius, Molinos, 3 men 15 centuries apart. 3 completely different cultural traditions, the same fundamental instruction: stop reacting, stop explaining, stop performing, become the person who has nothing left for them to seize. Here's the question you should be sitting with. Why was none of this kept secret? The spiritual guide was published, The Prince was published, the Meditations was eventually printed. None of these books are hidden. None of them require a special initiation to read. You can buy all 3 on the same afternoon for less than the cost of a meal. And yet you've never been taught any of this in school. You've never heard a single sermon, lecture, or self-help book describe Quietism as a tradecraft instead of a heresy. You've been raised inside an emotional culture that tells you the opposite of what these 3 men wrote, that you should express yourself, that you should explain yourself, that silence is suspicious, that detachment is unhealthy, that not reacting is a sign of psychological damage. Watch what that emotional culture serves. Watch who profits when you're easy to provoke. Watch what happens to your relationships, your career, your bank account, and your self-image when you're an open emotional system that can be reached, triggered, and harvested by anyone who learns the right buttons. The Vatican was an institution, your boss is an institution, the dating market is an institution, social media is an institution, each one runs on the same currency. Molinos was teaching people to stop minting. The technique didn't die. The vocabulary changed. Molinos called it interior silence. Stoics called it apatheia. Machiavelli called it concealment. Modern psychology calls it gray rock. Modern self-help calls it emotional discipline. They're the same practice in different costumes. What was banned was the costume. What never went away was the practice. Look at how the 17th century played this out. Because the pattern is what matters more than any single name. After Molinos' arrest, the Roman Inquisition extended the proceedings. They reached into convents and removed copies. They forced confessions. They identified more than 200 Roman practitioners and processed them through their own tribunals. The proceedings continued, in Italy alone, well into the 18th century.
In France, Madame Guyon was arrested in December of 1695. She spent her time in 3 separate prisons: Vincennes from 1695 to 1696, the convent of Vaugirard from 1696 to 1698, the Bastille from 1698 to 1703. 8 years confined. According to the final section of her own autobiography, she suffered verbal abuse, physical abuse, denial of the sacraments, and at least 2 recorded attempts to poison her. She was released in 1703. She lived another 14 years and died in 1717. Fenelon, her famous disciple, was condemned by the Vatican in 1699. He died in 1715, theologically marginalized. That is the bill. The Vatican was willing to pay a pope's apostolic constitution. A pope's theologian publicly humiliated a career cardinal under Inquisition arrest. A French king collaborating in 8-year imprisonments. An archbishop officially condemned. 200 Roman citizens prosecuted. 20,000 pieces of correspondence catalogued and sealed away. For what? For a method of prayer? Read that bill again. That's not what an institution spends on theology. That's what an institution spends on a doctrine that has stopped reacting to its authority. Bring it forward. You're not a 17th century quietist. You don't have an inquisition assigned to you. The pattern, however, is now installed in every direction of your life, and the people who run the pattern have read all the same books you have. When someone in your life wants something from you, they won't ask. They'll provoke. They'll create a situation in which you have to respond, and the response is what they were after. A demand to explain a decision isn't actually about the decision. A demand for an emotional reaction isn't actually about the moment that supposedly caused it. A demand for an apology isn't actually about the offense. The currency is your engagement, and the transaction is your loss of position.
Molinos' 3 stages map onto this directly. Discipline of speech defends you against the verbal trap. Discipline of thought defends you against the imagined argument that hasn't yet happened. Discipline of will defends you against the emotional consequence of either one. You don't have to be a mystic to use this. You don't even have to be religious. You just have to be willing to do what one Spanish priest got 263 charges for writing down. Stop reacting, stop explaining, stop performing. Become the kind of person whose interior can't be reached by anyone who hasn't been invited. You won't be canonized for it. You probably won't be popular for it. You may, however, notice that the people who used to control your day no longer do. In the autumn of 1687, the spiritual guide was burned. Copies were called in, owners were warned. The index of forbidden books grew by 1 more entry. The most successful Catholic devotional book of its decade was wiped formally from the religious record of Europe. You can buy it again now. There are public domain editions. There are scholarly translations. The book is sitting on the open internet, free in 12 languages. It survived because the only thing that was ever banned was the word for it. The practice itself was older than Molinos. It's older than Marcus Aurelius. It's older than Machiavelli. It's older than any institution that has ever tried to suppress it. 350 years ago, a Spaniard wrote it down in a way that everyone could follow. The Pope condemned it. The Inquisition jailed 200 Romans for using it. A French king assisted in jailing the woman who carried it across borders. The most powerful institutional apparatus in 17th century Europe spent 12 years trying to make sure no one would learn what was actually in those 240 pages. They failed. You're watching a video on it. The cult that took Machiavelli's silence too far wasn't insane. It was earlier than the world was ready for. What Rome did is what every authority always does when it sees a population learning the one trick it can't regulate. What you do with that knowledge is the only part of this story that hasn't yet been written.